All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am Carmen Agouridis, and with me I've got Lauren Cagle. So I guess you of all on Zoom probably do not see us. You should be seeing the slides that we have. Those in the audience get a chance to watch us here where we're today. And we're going to cover a lot of things today, but we're also just going to let you know we're hitting somewhat the tip of the iceberg of all the information that we got from the survey. So first of all, I want to say thank you if you took the survey or if you sent it out to your friends to take. We really appreciate it because we got more responses, I think, than we were anticipating in the time that we had it out. So again, we're very thankful for that. But like I said, we're going to, the goal of this is to really provide you some insights into what we had. Now, I partnered with Cagle because I met her a few years back when we were at another event that was focusing on climate. And Cagle specializes in climate communication, and that is not something I specialize in. I specialize more in the technical side, in the water resources, but being an extension, I wanted to figure out how I could better communicate technical information to audiences, and is there a way that I'm not quite doing it? And that was a big part of the reason for our collaboration, because I think we both bring different skill sets to the table, and she definitely helps me understand how people receive information and how I should phrase it better. And I think this and what we're going to hopefully provide for you today is going to give you a lot of insights into what we learned from the study on how we might want to phrase and do some of our communications. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to walk you through Carmen here in a second. We'll take back over just briefly to give you the overview of the project. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the research study that we conducted in the survey she mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about methods because my guess is it's hard to do a show of hands when most people are on Zoom, but my guess is most of the folks in the audience are not social scientists or humanists, so the methods that we use are perhaps not as familiar to you, so I do want to spend a little time on those. Then the part you're all waiting for, the findings. So what are some of the big findings from the survey? As Carmen mentioned, we're just going to be sort of like scratching the surface with it, but of course we have this amazing data set that will be available to if you want to sort of consult with us after the fact about your specific needs. And then takeaways, we do want to sort of drive home a few of the big messages that we got from the survey results. And then finally a Q&A. So folks on Zoom, we'll ask if you'll put questions in the Zoom chat at the end during the Q&A. We've got you muted right now so that you don't have to worry about it.
And for those of you in person, we're going to be repeating your questions just to make sure the folks on the audience here. And also, if you're having trouble with Zoom chat, my cell number, you can text questions to me as well. It is 859-533-4373. Again, that's 859-533-4373, and you can text questions that way as well. So just a little bit about the project. This project is to give a big shout out to the Kentucky Water Resources Research Institute. They provided the funding for this project, so the survey that we're doing, and also when we get to the latter part to talk about the Kentucky Climate Consortium, which we'll show you a website for that and invite you all to participate in that part of it. But really what precipitated this was we wanted to kind of assess what do Kentuckians know about climate change? What is their awareness? And also what is their awareness and knowledge about water resources issues? And the big goal when we were setting out to doing this was really to kind of help professionals who deal in the water area understand best how to communicate with the public, with our end goal being we want to use this information to help guide us when we develop training materials, whether it be workshops, whether it be extension publications, or even things like this, trying to help guide us in that communications part of it. And as Cagle mentioned, there's a lot of stuff, as you'll see on our bottom, our future plans that extend beyond the grant timeline and what we're going to be doing with this, because as you will see when we start scratching the surface, we got a lot of really interesting data out of this.
Mm-hmm. And I just saw someone in the face-to-face audience take a picture of our slide, which reminded me to tell you all, if you want to see the slides, you can go to my website. It's Lauren, Laurene Cagle, which is Cagle.com. Once you're there, you can click on the tab for talks, and there's a link to the slides with our notes, so you can see our notes to each other. Don't forget to say so-and-so. Right there on the website. So we wanted to make sure that you had access either during the talk, if you wanted to sort of flip back and forth, or later. Okay, so this is us. I'm Cagle. As Carmen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies, but my sort of primary focus is environmental rhetoric, climate change communication. So I teach technical communication courses here at the university, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Probably everyone knows Carmen.
So I'm an extension professor in biosystems and ag engineering. I focus on ecosystem restoration. A lot of work I primarily do is in water. Recently, I'm now the associate dean for instruction in the College of Ag, Food, and Environment. And we had some amazing undergrads that helped us with this project. Amazing undergraduates. Unfortunately, both could not be here today because I don't know if you heard, but the semester is back on and students are busy. So Amanda Bresman, who is an ENS major, environmental and sustainability studies, was one of our undergraduate research assistants. She has prior experience working with the Counselor for Post-Secondary Education and doing kind of large-scale project management work. Maria Sanchez is a triple major in environmental and sustainability studies, political science, double major and then a minor in statistics. And so we brought her on as well, since we're going to be handling this data. And, doing research with undergraduates can be incredibly rewarding, as I'm sure many people know. And it has been with these two. So we definitely wanted to give them a shout out for their assistance. Okay, so methods. So as Carmen said, I'm very flattered and verklempt that she's like, I learned so much from our collaboration. I did the same. I know way more about water than I did before I met Carmen Agouridis, which I think is true for a lot of people probably. So as we were collaborating, it really was from the get-go. There was no sort of handing off of pieces of the project. It was a true collaboration from the start. We designed the whole thing start to finish. The expertise that I brought was that sort of social science humanities method. So how do we get at constructs like people's attitudes or people's values or people's knowledge and education, right? That's actually very difficult to do. Sometimes when I'm doing research, I think, man, what if I got to just work with plants? That would be awesome, right? They don't ask silly questions. But the data collection process in some ways was a fairly straightforward social science project. We had proposed doing a survey, and then we realized when we sat down to write the survey that one of the problems with doing this sort of large-scale data collection is that you're limited by what you know, right? So when you're trying to design survey questions, you can only ask about what you know to ask about. And we really wanted to kind of expand our sense of what might be worth asking about by talking to a larger variety of people. So we began by conducting a series of interviews with experts. So we talked to folks in ag extension, we talked to river basin coordinators, we talked to folks who are active in recreational water communities, water sports communities, and just tried to get a sense of what are the water issues in Kentucky, what are the climate issues in Kentucky, what are their kind of takes on how the public, which is an overgeneralization, we'll get there, but members of the public that they talk to, how they sort of think about and respond to issues of water and climate. So based on those interviews, we conducted an informal sort of coding process where the 4 members of our research team sat down, talked about the major themes to come out of these interviews, and then developed the survey based on that. So the survey was designed to measure public attitudes, values, and education about water. So it's the WAVE survey, water, attitudes, value, education. Unfortunately, we didn't come up with that cool acronym until after applying for the grant, thanks to my sister who actually went, those letters stand for something. And in order to get at those mental constructs, we used a variety of quantitative and qualitative questions in the survey. So that's called mixed methods research, where you mix the quantitative kind of
numbers driven, and qualitative, sort of open-ended question driven. Now, the value of an approach like this is that it allows you to both ask about phenomena that you already know you're interested in, and also discover phenomena that you don't yet know you need to be interested in, right? So when we design quantitative surveys, like rank the values associated with your personal use of water, right? What's more important, cost or accessibility? What's more important, reliability or quality? That's because we know that those are values people hold about water. However, we also asked really open-ended questions, which we'll get more into, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear aquifer, creek, river basin, river? Because we don't know what associations people have with those water resources. And if we want to advise people about how to go out and talk to the public, what we need to know is, where are we trying to meet them, right? So using that mixed methods approach really allowed us to discover unexpected kind of delights in the data, and new phenomena and constructs that we would love to kind of investigate further, and might give you all some ideas of things you can kind of investigate in your own local contexts. One note, so the survey is primarily focused on water. So the questions are all about water, literally until the last 2 questions of the survey. So after all the demographics, we asked 2 questions about climate. And the reason that we did that is we didn't want people to self-select out of taking the survey because they have strong political views on climate. So we were hoping to capture their views, the data on attitudes, values, and education about water before kind of priming them with the word climate, which for many people can be sort of a hot button political issue, of course. We also distributed the survey. So speaking of self-selection, we did distribute the survey via primarily listservs, professional organizations, and flyering in various places. We tried to do a little hard copy distribution at Ag Extension offices, and that was not a particularly successful method. So if we were to do this again, we would revisit kind of hard copy distribution mechanisms. The result of that distribution process is that the results that we have, the data that we have, is not statistically representative of the state of Kentucky. So we do have a bounded population, right? We could say we want to do a statistically representative sample. However, that is very expensive and difficult to do these days when people don't have landlines, many people. So really a mail-out survey, or a combination of mail-out and phone survey, is the best way to get a statistically representative sample, and that is very expensive. So if anyone has about $10,000 and would love for us to run this again, I'm up for it. But until we have that kind of a larger scale of funding, we're going with the less statistically representative but still meaningful data that we've gotten from this distribution mechanism. Okay, we did, as Carmen said, get just a ton of results, which was really great. Over 500 responses for a 27 question survey, which is kind of incredible. Yeah. So for the quantitative data analysis, once we had all the data in from the survey, we have conducted preliminary analysis on it. There's still a lot left to do. So we captured the demographic data, including industry experience, age, county of residence, or zip code, which we then translated into county of residence, industry, I said industry experience, one more, ethnicity and gender, so standard demographic data. So those are independent variables that we can then sort of correlate and try and build a predictive model around the attitudes, values, and education. But that's a lot of variables that we're looking at. So for our analysis today, we've primarily focused on county of residence, and then we've generalized from that to region. So it's the
extension. So basically the extension districts is how we partition this out to look at.
So that way we had significant numbers of results in each district to look at. We're also working with the Applied Statistics Lab on campus, who are great. And also the first time we sat down to meet with them and handed over the survey for them to look at, Arnie Stromberg, the head of the ASL, said, "How in the world did you get so many people to respond to this? It's so long." And we said, people care about water, which is cool. So they're working on some correlations for us and some predictive models. So we're sharing with you sort of the preliminary analysis that we're at. All right, as for the qualitative data, so qualitative data analysis, I did want to spend a little time on, because as I said, my hunch is most folks are not familiar, at least not experientially, with this kind of data collection and analysis. So the way that we handle qualitative data can vary in the social sciences. The approach that we took is something called inductive coding. So what that means is you develop codes, which are categories that you kind of apply to little bits of your data set. and you develop those codes inductively. So what we did is we had 2 members of the research team, myself and Amanda, read every single response that was an open-ended qualitative response to every single question on the survey. So for a single question, question 17, where we asked people what kind of terms do you associate with reservoir, aquifer, et cetera, we had literally over 3,500 data points. So over 3,500 responses that we read one by one, and then developed a series of codes for. So the independent members of the team each developed a set of codes. So you read the data and you sort of write down, here are the categories I see sort of emerging. Like lots of people are talking about recreation in these spaces. Lots of people are talking about who's to blame for problems. Lots of people are talking about whatever. Then you get together and you compare your categories essentially. And it's for us, it ended up being about a 3-hour meeting where we kind of hashed it out and tried to develop a set of categories that captured all of the categories we had independently seen and that would capture the entire data set. So the idea is that you want to build a set of codes so that every single response in your data set can be sorted somewhere, and so that no code is alone in no response is alone in a category, right? So that you're building meaningful groups of responses. So we did that for all of our answers, and what you end up with when you build these categories is what's called a code book. So your code book is your list of categories. So then you have to go back through all the data, and both members of the coding team, the analysis team, code every single response in the data. So we take every single response and say, oh, it fits in this category, it fits in this category, it fits in this category. We did vary our approaches depending on the type of question that we were looking at data for. So in some cases, there was a very strict, a response can only fit into one category. You have to pick a category. In other cases, a response can fit into multiple categories because we're capturing multiple different types of information about the response, right? So what this looks like is that, for example, if we're coding by type of activity, then we would want to sort the responses into specific and discrete activity categories. But if we're coding by both type of activity and maybe whether or not they mention water infrastructure, then we might sort a response into multiple coding categories, right? It just depends on what we're trying to get out. So you may be sitting there thinking like, this is, lengthy, but perhaps not comprehensive in the sense that we are limited by the things that we're looking for, right? So there might be themes or codes or ideas in the data that we're not capturing in our categories. And my response to that is yes. The same is true with quantitative data, right? You only find what you look for. So you only find the correlations that you look for. You only find the patterns that you look for. So what we were doing was going into this project knowing that we wanted to come up with meaningful suggestions for folks who are communicating with the public. So that was our sort of guiding parameter for developing these codes, was what is information that might be useful for people who have to go out and talk to folks. So we were avoiding the kind of more heavily theoretical approaches I might take if I was just doing this for research publication, and really trying to aim at sort of concrete, what are the ways that people are telling us they think about water that then can translate into communication situations. The last thing to know about this coding process is that once both members of the team have gone away and coded independently, you then bring back and compare the codes to make sure that you're doing it similarly, right? So it's not just, oh, here's what I think, here's what you think. So what that's called is inter-rater reliability. So you can develop a mathematical measure of inter-rater reliability, the level of agreement. And then you can calculate a kappa coefficient to determine what are the odds that the level of reliability you have achieved is actually meaningful and not just a matter of random chance, right? If we were just sort of randomly checking off categories. So our inter-rater reliability, as it turned out, was all over the map. So we had about half our codes were 80% or above, which is very good. And maybe a third were in the 40 to 60 range, which is not great. And what that means when you discover this is that means that that category is not yet clear. So you actually have to go back to the code book and refine the code book. So in terms of our data analysis, that's the stage that we're at right now. What we're sharing with you today is some takeaways from the pieces of the data where we have already established some real shared inter-rater, some high inter-rater reliability, a shared understanding of what the codes are. So I think that's it for analysis. Findings. All right, here's the exciting part. I'm going to let Carmen talk a little bit about the quantitative. Is that okay? All right.
All right, so up here you see a map of Kentucky, and it's broken out by our extension district. So that's kind of how we decided to group the counties, since our focus primarily when we started out was we thought this would be extension personnel largely that would communicate some of this. That was how we did it. The numbers you see up here are the number of responses we got from different areas. And so when we did this survey, we sent this out to all the ag and natural resource agents. We sent it out to 4-H agents, things like that, and asked them if they would be willing to send it off to other personnel. So you can see the region 4, which we're sitting in, got a big number. So that's not fairly surprising for us because that's kind of our hometown or home spot of the University of Kentucky. But that's where we got the bulk of it. But we were able to cover the entire state. So Cagle also mentioned looking at the demographics. The things that you're going to notice on here is we're fairly evenly split male-female. We've got more female respondents than we did males. But you also notice we are a very high Caucasian group of respondents, which isn't completely unsurprising to me considering it's an environmental area and we see this a lot in environmental education. But those are what we're seeing across the state. When Cagle mentioned industry, we had, oh my gosh, close to 20 codes possible or 20 selection possibilities for industry.
Drawn from the U.S. Department of Labor categories from the Census Bureau, or that the Census Bureau uses from the Department of Labor. So it's, yeah, I think 21 categories maybe.
It's quite a few. We're only showing you some of these, and it'll become more evident as Cagle goes through. It talks about some of these findings, the reason we're showing you some of these. So the percentage you see on there is the percent of respondents who identified with a particular industry. And not surprisingly, we have a very high percentage that have identified in some way with agriculture. Keeping in mind, this is not a sole thing, right? So somebody may say, I'm in agriculture, but maybe because I maybe have a personal farm at home and I do that, but maybe I also work say in a public education. So they could identify in multiple categories. It wasn't a one only type of thing. Fishing and hunting, we put that in there. We're going to start talking about recreation when it comes in there, and that was a category that seemed to closely align with what we deemed what would be in recreation. Forestry's in there as well, so that could be natural resources or also silviculture, so you look in that part of it. Manufacturing and some utilities would be more what we might look at as industry individuals. And then our resource extraction summarizes anybody that's involved in, say, coal mining, natural gas, anything along those lines that might be extracting resources from the earth. So you can see we're heavily an ag state, or ag respondents as we would expect, and decreases as we go down. All right. All right. So we'll run through each of these. And so the categories we're going to be looking at, there's going to be personal, recreational, industrial, and agriculture. And the things that you're going to see on here are the values that people would place. So we have, do you have accessibility to water? So that's going to show up in blue on these pie charts. The next one is going to be affordability. So how important was that for you when you were considering this type of use? Quality, and then reliability. So the first one that you see here is personal. And the one thing that jumped out to me when looking at if I was using water for personal use, maybe that's my drinking water, quality is really important. So people really care about having safe water when they're using it for personal use. So that's a really big one. Accessibility was in the other big chunk of the pie. And so this is looking total statewide. We have it broken out by our extension regions, but that's a little probably much for us to be able to get into it in this time frame. We jump into recreational, and we think about recreation like I'm swimming, I'm boating, I might be fishing or something like that. So where your body is actually going to be in contact with water in some way. And the same things really show up. You worry about, one, can I be in water that's going to be safe and I don't have to worry about having some sort of health issue with that. But then the other part is also going to be accessibility. So people wanted to have water where they could get to and recreate in. They wanted to have access to water that was good quality they could get to. Industry is all over the place. So the industry, unlike personal and recreational, didn't have one category that was really, really dominant. There were issues with accessibility. There were issues with quality. You started to see more of reliability. So that can make sense. If I'm in industry, then I wanted to make sure I have a good water supply for whatever I'm doing. And then also some affordability. So that one came in there more. And so, you know, industry is going to be buying a lot higher volume of water than you would at your personal home. So that seemed to pop up in there. And then our last one was agriculture. And what struck us about agriculture is this is the one where having accessibility really jumped. So accessibility got to be the big driver or the dominant one in this. So making sure that you have accessible water, whether that be through natural means like rainfall, or whether that could be through, you know, I have access to groundwater or something like that to irrigate my crops. That became a big driver, more so obviously than affordability or quality. Another question that we asked on there really related to what concerns would people have about future use as it relates to water. So these, and we have the survey if anybody wants to see those exact questions pulled up again, but really kind of grouped into what did you think about it. So when and you could pick multiple things on there, but when I think about the future and I have concerns, you know, things like safety popped up a lot. So if you look at recreation and drinking, those were high categories. And when you look in the agricultural area, rainfall was a big one. And it's not just the amount of rainfall, but also we think about timing the rainfall, right? So when does rainfall happen? Flooding wasn't as high an issue as we thought. We thought flooding, especially, you know, considering some urban areas, might be a higher one, but anything more out on this? All right. Then the other one was another question we looked at was what did they think about their local water resources? And so these would be questions that go with, so infrastructure would be something like the infrastructure is good where I'm at. You know, I can get the water to me. Weather predictability would be that the weather is predictable enough so farmers can plan in advance. The weather daily would be weather in my area is generally the same from year to year. So it's fairly consistent pattern. The 20 years would be weather in my area will be about the same in 20 years as it is from now. Appearance is that water looks clean. Invisible pollutants were that in my natural water resources in my area, there are invisible pollutants that I can't see. And accessibility was that water is easy to get where I'm at. So those are basically what we were asking for. And while Cagle mentioned we didn't ask any climate direct questions till the end, it was kind of interesting, I think, for me to see weather 20 years out, the number of respondents that said, oh yeah, the weather is going to be the same 20 years from now. So whether or not they may think there is some sort of climate change or not, they're already saying that no, there is variability in the weather, and that 20 years from now, I don't expect it to be what it is.
And one other data point, if I may note, when we did our interviews with experts that we built the survey on, one of the topics that came up frequently was that public concern about natural water resources often focuses on visible contaminants, visible pollution. So solid waste, trash, scum, so on and so forth. So it was really interesting to see this high level, over 50% of concern about invisible pollutants, because that suggests that there is in fact sort of fertile ground for talking about pollutants, invisible pollutants, in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have expected to see.
Okay. The other thing that you're going to see here is we also ask questions about what do people know about watersheds in general. So when you do, a lot of times we go into and talk about water resources, watersheds is often something that a lot of educators will use as a way to walk in. On this graph, you're going to see the blue, and it appears statewide. And we intentionally put Fayette County up next to it, largely because when Fayette County was going through the beginnings of their consent decree here, they had a survey, I think it was around 2008, that went out and was asking residents, questions about what they knew about water and so forth. And one of the questions on there was basically asking, did they know what a watershed was? And I think at the time it was less than 10% of respondents actually knew what a watershed was. What I was really excited when I saw this was the number of respondents that recognized that we all live in a watershed. So that's usually one of the questions we always start out with in a lot of our education. I know in the past decade is we've got to let them know that they're in a watershed and that what they do impacts it. And so we were really, at least I was really excited to see how high the number of respondents said, oh yeah, we all live in a watershed. So that was really happy. I was also really happy to see that most people know that watersheds are not buildings that hold water. So that's what's on the far left. But there were other things that, that was kind of exciting for us, that they would know that all water in a watershed goes to a common place, that watersheds can vary in size. So that was one that really stuck out, and that watersheds are linked together. So while we're not at 100% on getting folks knowing that, just the fact that we, at least I've seen in the last decade, the amount of knowledge that's gained in that area is, to me, really, really promising.
Okay. So I'll take back over as the primary driver, because we're shifting into more of the qualitative data now. So what you're about to see, the visualizations are from that coding process that I described earlier. So when we looked at the types of water use, what Amanda and I ended up doing was actually developing independent codes for each type of use. So we asked a question that said, when you think about your personal water use, can you think of a time in the last 5 years when there's been a problem, right? And then describe that problem to us. So for personal use, the problems that people described varied pretty widely. And we saw a lot of quality, as to be expected, given that the number one value that we saw in the pie charts that Carmen was showing earlier was quality. And so in fact, quality was so dominant in this response, this set of responses, that we had to break it down. So we had 7 different quality categories. There was quality pollution, quality contamination, quality smell, quality taste, quality chemical, quality metal, and quality visible appearance. So 7 different categories. So I wanted to show you some of the notable themes outside of what we expected to see based on the quantitative data. So for personal use, we actually ended up developing a number of codes that we sort of lumped into this socio-political set of categories. So thinking about the socio-political context in which people access personal use water, issues like agents of power matter. So who has control over the water, who gets decision-making rights over water, communication, and trust are the 3. So I just pulled all of the responses that we coded into these categories and dropped them into a word cloud for you. So you can see that folks are really concerned about things like FOIL advisories, right? They're really concerned about, even within this context of the sociopolitics, it's the effect that it has on water quality, and particularly on available drinking water. Right? So if you're not familiar with word clouds as a visualization, the bigger the word, the more frequently appeared in that data set. The colors don't mean anything, they're just pretty. So yeah, so that was very interesting. Particularly the communication piece. I also started coding, it's not finished, this analysis is not finished, but I started coding the personal use data set for issues of timeliness. So people talking about, we didn't get access in time, we didn't get communications in time, so on and so forth. So there's a real time factor involved where people feel like they're owed timely delivery and communication about water. In terms of recreational use, again, quality was the big thing. As I said to Carmen when we were talking about this data, it's not surprising that for these 2 categories, which is water that you put in you or water that you put yourself in, quality is like the key driver. Outside of quality, recreational use really stuck out in that we developed a series of codes around specific descriptions, so specific experiences, places, and water resource types. So often in the other categories, we'd have people talk about a problem in a very generalized sense, right? Dirty water, scummy water, tasted bad. But when they were talking about recreation, they were naming specific places that they recreate, specific types of recreation that they do, and the specific experiences that they've had. So they would be thinking of an actual memory, right? This one time I was at this lake and this thing happened while I was kayaking. We didn't see that to the same extent in any of the other data sets. So the types of water resources that people are thinking about in terms of recreation are obviously lake, river, and stream. These are the places that people are primarily recreating in Kentucky. The types of recreation they're doing are fishing, kayaking, and swimming, right? So that's really interesting to note that these are the ones that people are turning to. All right, so the third one I want to show you is industrial use. So I want to add a bit of a caveat to this particular little set of responses, which is that when we asked these questions, we said, based on your use of water for industrial purposes, right? Based on your use of water for recreational purposes. What was very apparent in the industrial responses, though, is a lot of people ignored that instruction and answered as people external to industry. So not folks kind of inside industry using water, but folks observing use of water from outside industry. Additionally, we found, and this is not surprising given the state that we live in, that a lot of folks were conflating agriculture and industry, right? That those are sort of synonymous, exchangeable. And so they were using this category as a place to talk about things like livestock, pollution, base pollution, runoff, that sort of thing. So if we were to run this again, we did not preclude people from answering this question who didn't check the appropriate, industry experience box. That is an option if you're doing a digital survey. You can sort of channel people, but also we could just disambiguate and even ask, sort of knowing that people want to say stuff about industry, like people who hadn't recreated. We didn't get any answers that were like, well, I don't kayak, but those kayakers down the road, right? Like that wasn't a thing, but people have things to say about industry. So it's possible that we would want to add a question to give people the opportunity to get those things off their chest. So it is not surprising then that placing blame was a theme that sort of came up. So this goes beyond the agents of power that I mentioned in personal use. This isn't just about who's in charge, who's the decision maker. This is about who's at fault for problems. So the problems that blame is being placed or is being attributed because of are pollution, contamination, chemical dumping. And then the places that blame is being placed tends to be mining and chemical kind of treatments, chemical discharges, that sort of thing, right? So folks are really, both from within those external or those internal responses and external, people are really concerned about what industry is doing to our water resources. And then finally, we have agricultural use. So with ag use, as Carmen noted on the pie charts, the values that we saw really jump out were access and quality. And that was the only category in which access overtook quality as a concern, as a primary value. So one of the ways that access kind of played itself out in our qualitative data set was around questions of infrastructure. So infrastructure that doesn't exist or infrastructure that's broken. So if you work in water in Kentucky, the idea of infrastructure being old or broken or missing is not surprising, right? But it is interesting to note that folks working in agriculture are feeling this very immediately, right? So they're concerned about their needs, they're concerned about their pipes, they're concerned about their wells. And then one of the most interesting things to me is that even within the context of infrastructure, and then I also included the placing blame category because those codes overlapped significantly, where there was blame being placed for why the infrastructure doesn't exist or why the infrastructure is broken and not being fixed. Even within that set of categories, pollution is still a primary concern. So when you look at that pie chart and you see quality and access, those are not two different values. They're intertwined in agriculture, right? They are issues that affect each other. Okay, so the next bit of data that I want to show you is in relation to, or in response to this question, think about each of the following terms. For each one, write the word or phrase that first comes to mind. If nothing comes to mind, skip that term. So these are the 12 terms that we gave people. Only one person out of our 538 responses around term 6 wrote, "These are too many terms," as their response. But everybody else seemed to be okay with it. Because it really was just sort of a free association, like word game, right? Just write a word or two that comes to mind. So we coded these using the same code. So for the personal recreational, industrial, agriculture, as I said, we developed a set of codes internal to each of those questions, depending on the responses. Here, we wanted to be able to compare across types, right? So we used a shared set of codes across each of these types. So one of the codes that we used was neutral responses. So we're defining neutral as descriptions of physical features, descriptions of natural functions, and technical definitions. So for an aquifer, that might be something like a large underground storage cavern, right? For something like a stream, it might be small river, right? So a sort of neutral, emotion-free description, something that, at least in terms of content, you might find in a textbook or a fact sheet or something like that. There were a lot of those, but they did vary significantly across our resource types. So I've sorted them by neutral, percent of neutral response. So the water resource that people, their first instinct, right? When you say, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Their first instinct is a neutral technical definition is aquifers. And they are least likely to go to a neutral technical definition with rain. Now, there's a lot of ways to interpret this, right? And one of which is simply a matter of physical proximity and experience, right? I've never touched an aquifer, but I have rain in my shoes right now, right? So it makes sense that I would need to resort to a technical definition to talk about an aquifer, whereas with rain, I have lots of options, right? I could define it technically. I could also talk about the puddle that I splashed in today, right? I can also talk about the rain helping my tomatoes grow. I have a lot of experiences to draw from. So we're thinking of this kind of percent neutral response as sort of a proxy for familiarity and comfort, right? The less familiar and comfortable you are with a particular water resource, the more you have to kind of fall back on a technical definition. So we see this kind of trend where we go from aquifers, watersheds, reservoirs, river basins, which are sort of these big abstractions that you can't be like, I'm touching the watershed. I mean, technically you can, right? But it doesn't seem sort of definable, experientiable in the same way. Experienceable?
It's more of an abstract concept.
Yeah,
for most people.
An abstract concept, right? So this might be really useful for folks going out, is to know that when you're talking about rain, right, it probably doesn't occur to you to define it either. But if you know that you can deliberately sort of skip over defining that, but then maybe that's your way into making people feel more connected to an aquifers by starting with something that they're already really familiar or comfortable with, and then you can kind of work your way backwards. Now, we map this against another set of codes, which were affective responses. So affect in humanities speak is any sort of emotional response, internal response. So we have three kind of subcategories within that we lumped in, which were emotions, emotional responses, spiritual responses, and aesthetic responses. So that might be something like in response to creek, someone wrote babbling, right? Yeah, that's a physical description, but that's a very particular kind of evocative aesthetic word. In response to rain, somebody wrote manna, right? So that's a sort of spiritual connection connotation. In response to oceans, somebody wrote God's gift, right? So we captured that data, and it's not a perfect kind of inverse, but we do see kind of a trend upwards. So the less likely they are to turn to a technical definition, the more likely you are to see an affective response, right? But with some notable exceptions, such as groundwater and ponds. So for groundwater, we have we're right kind of in the middle. We've got somewhere between 35 and 40% of folks offered a technical definition, but very few people had an affective response to the concept of groundwater. So that means they're responding in some other way, right? They're responding kind of experientially, or they're describing something. In that particular case, what most of the responses were human uses, right? So drinking water. It was drinking. Like when you sort the data alphabetically, there's a lot of D's. For ponds, similar. So for ponds, we have very few technical definitions. Very few people felt the need to actually define what a pond is, and instead they named agricultural uses, right? Okay, so then we also mapped this, excuse me, against, next slide. So on top of this, we also coded for responses that express concern. So any responses that express concern about that water resource, whether it was concern about flooding, about drought, so recharge, discharge, about pollution, contamination, about management, right? People talked about the need for better management, particularly with, for example, aquifers and groundwater management. The idea of management came up. And so you can actually kind of track here, again, the trends are not identical, but there are some really interesting data points in terms of where people are actually concerned. So the one that really captured our attention again is groundwater, kind of right there in the middle. So people don't feel the need to technically define groundwater very often. They don't have affective responses to it, but they're really worried about it, right? That's interesting. We can do something with that. Rain, right? So very few people sort of neutrally responded to rain or defined rain. A lot of people have affective responses to rain. They feel positive about it. So we didn't distinguish between positive and negative affect, but in the case of rain, it was almost exclusively positive. But they're really worried about it, right? But what they're not worried about is aquifers, which is super interesting because...
Like groundwater aquifers, there's a connection.
Right. So that tells us something about what the terms are that we need to be using if we're wanting to tap into people's existing levels of concern.
And for me, because I work a lot with streams, it was the term creeks.
Yeah.
And so that for me really popped out, seeing that connection. So a lot of times I think more in the technical sense when I talk about a stream, but if you can see on here, people more personally associate with the term creek.
Yeah.
And so for me, that tells me maybe I should be using that more often in my language when I go out to speak. Instead of talking about a stream, maybe I should really be talking about a creek.
Yeah. And honestly, with creeks, the affective code could be higher. We were being very conservative in our coding. So we coded childhood memories as affective, but not childhood, for example, right? Because childhood might be, there are kids in my neighborhood who play in the creek and might not indicate. We were trying to be conservative, so we didn't overestimate effects. But I'm confident in saying that the creeks in particular, that affective response could be a lot higher. Another one that I was like, I can't code this as affective in any, like, as a good social scientist, but I really want to, was crawdads, right? Yeah. So I think creeks is the way to go if you want to talk about streams and get people caring about them.
It evokes those childhood memories.
Yeah. All right. We're almost through. So speaking of expressions of concern, I just wanted to pop up here. This is across all those water resources, every response that indicated some expression of concern. So pollution far and away, right, is the thing people are most concerned about. At the very least, it is the word that they know to describe the thing that they're worried about. So that is a sort of key point to keep in mind, right? Pollution might capture solid waste, invisible pollution, contaminants, right? A couple of folks did mention invasive species. We saw Asian carp come up, algae blooms, right? All of these things are sort of, I think, I don't have strong evidence for people are capturing in this term pollution, but it's pointing to water quality in general. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is our climate change data. So this is not our map. This is from the Yale Climate Communication Program. And they conduct large-scale national surveys every year on attitudes about or beliefs about global warming. So they use the term global warming instead of climate change because that's what they were using like 10 years ago or whatever when they started. And they're trying to be consistent, so they get year-over-year data. So this is the data that they have from 2018 for the percent of adults in Kentucky who think global warming is happening. So the most significant thing to notice is that every single county in the state, and they have county level data, they do have statistically representative data, is above 50%. So across every county in Kentucky, more than 50% of adults think that global warming is happening, which I think is, I show this map all the time, or versions of this map, and people are so surprised, right? Now, our survey was a little higher. So ours trended up towards about 65.5%. Not all that surprising considering the high number of responses we had from Region 4, which includes Fayette and Jefferson County. Yeah. Okay. Here's where things change a little. If you ask, do you think global warming is happening and it's caused by human activities? Okay, now we see a drop. Right now we're below the 50%. But we're in light blue category, right? We're in the sort of 40 to 50 category for most of Kentucky. So it's actually a lot higher numbers of Kentuckians will at least self-report that they believe global warming is happening and caused by human activities. And I think this is important to note because it's easy to go out to non-urban spaces or to spaces where you don't know people's beliefs or politics or scientific background and make assumptions, right? So I think it's useful to have this data to kind of counterbalance whatever assumptions you might be carrying into conversations with you. So our respondents, I broke that down. So 65.5% either said yes or unsure. I think there's some global warming happening. Maybe it's not humans, but the people who definitively said yes, global climate is changing because of human activities is 61.4%. So this, our set is definitely skewed from the overall Kentucky, but I didn't want to just show you the 61% number without also showing you this map, because I think if I'd taken a poll, probably people would have guessed way below 40%, right? Okay, so the last bit of interpretive data that I want to show you is for folks who said, yes, I believe climate change is happening because of human activities, we got asked, okay, what do you think the effects on water resources will be? And then when they gave us answers, we coded them by level of complexity. So we coded from 0 to 3. 0 is, I don't know, right? Just sort of, I got nothing for you. 1 was some sort of generalized description of impact, which would be, it's negative, it's gonna be bad, it'll have a big effect, right? 2 is isolated specific impact or impacts, right? So flooding, drought, increased variability in weather, right? Sort of a specific. And then 3 is people who demonstrated systems thinking in their response, some sort of cause effect. So because we're gonna get variable rain, that's gonna affect, crops. Because this, then that. Because water temperatures are increasing, we're gonna see marine life die off, right? Or marine is ocean. What do we call stream?
Freshwater.
Freshwater, thank you. See, I'm learning from the scientists. Yeah, so we're gonna see freshwater marine life die-offs. So here we see that we've got a lot of folks who are already aware of isolated specific impacts. We did not code by correctness, by the way, so they might not be right about these things, but we've got folks who have some sense of like, here's 1, 2, 3, 4 bad things that are gonna happen. And we have a much, much lower group of, or number of folks who are already at the point where they're thinking about how kind of these effects will trickle down over the years. And in Kentucky in particular, I think that's really important, that people can shift to a systems approach to thinking about issues like climate change. It's true everywhere, but just anecdotally, I used to research in Florida. And in Florida, sea level rise is the big conversation, right? And there's some very clear direct impacts of sea level rise around real estate loss, ecosystem loss, and salinization of freshwater, groundwater sources. And that's a very easy kind of one-to-one. But when you get somewhere like Kentucky, the effects are much harder to kind of point to and visualize and explain. And a systems thinking approach, so if you've got somebody who's systems thinking, it's gonna be much easier to kind of get them to understand the complexity of the issue. So as I was telling Carmen, my favorite answer in the set was someone who we coded as systems thinking, who said, well, I don't really know, but with glacier ice melt, maybe the water levels are gonna rise and then we'll have more flooding. And I said, that's not quite how that works, but I like the way you're thinking, right? Like that was my response to that, is that person, they're wrong about the details, but if we can get them the details, they're already in a place where they're thinking analytically. Okay, so our big takeaways, depending on use, different values will be at play. If you're thinking about or talking about personal use, quality is the value. If you're thinking about ag, quality and access are sort of balanced and intermingled. So if you're communicating about a particular value, so you're out in the field, you're talking to farmers, and you are trying to talk to them about water quality, that's not what's top of their mind when they're thinking about their farm, right? It's access. So if you can find a way, maybe through personal use, right? Connect your quality conversation to personal use to kind of evoke those values for them. In terms of, existing beliefs about people's concerns regarding the future and their local areas, right? Those we didn't show you broken down by region, but we do have that data. So if you know in your region, people generally think the infrastructure is in good shape, then you might have more of an uphill battle if you need to talk about infrastructure than if you're in, say, Martin County, right? Affective emotional versus technical neutral. That's my favorite graph. I made everybody who came into my office over the last couple of days look at that graph. Like, if you know what things people feel emotionally about, you can use that in your communications, right? I think there's this sense of, when we're doing scientific work or doing outreach, then we shouldn't be political. But that doesn't mean you have to stay technical neutral, right? You can talk to people about the stuff that they care about in terms that they recognize as value-based. And then finally, the systems thinking takeaway, we think it's really important to try and get people to be systems thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that data demonstrate, the number of people who are already thinking about impacts and already thinking about impacts in a systemic way, is that this kind of communication is not about dumbing it down. So I teach science communication and technical communication. And one of the first things I always say to students is we don't use the phrase dumbing it down, because that does a disservice both to your audience and to you as the communicator. It suggests that your audience is dumb, which is not a great place to start from if you want them to listen to. And it also suggests that your work is not that hard. Oh, all I have to do is like take out the jargon and make it simpler. No, what we're doing here is a translational process. We're trying to take this technical information that you need to communicate in your job and find ways to translate it into the values, into the frameworks, into the existing mental models and beliefs that the folks you're talking to have. And so I just want to encourage everybody to shift away, if you're used to that, because it's a very common framing, shift away from the sort of, oh, I just need to make it simple or dumb it down approach, and instead think about, I'm trying to translate this through values, through beliefs, through knowledge that people already have. And that's just as valid as the technical information I'm bringing to the conversation as well.
Yeah, I would say coming from this, some of the things that I looked at, and it was interesting, Cagle and I were talking about just through these results and how doing programming is, the RAIN. So a lot of times when I start a lot of my programming, we may start with the basics of just RAIN because it's something everybody can pretty much relate to. I don't know a single person that hasn't gotten rained on at some point. But the discipline I come through, biosystems engineering, I mean, we have systems in the title, and that's the thing that we really, I think, want people to be able to do is start to make some of these more complex connections. That if this happens, then this potentially could happen. How's this going to affect? Because then that helps them start to build solutions to what these problems may be and helps them kind of see that interconnectedness. So if I do solution A, how might it help what's going on? As opposed to just focusing, for instance, oh, it's got more rain, then okay, well, that could lead to potentially more water that gets to my streams at a faster rate. That could potentially lead to erosion. That could potentially be more contaminants that become in my water. So all these different things I need to be thinking about along the way. I think that's where we really want to get people at, because then they can start building more resilience in their solutions. And right now, from what we're seeing, it's more of, let me give you this technical piece of information, and then now what do I do with it? And we want them to be able to get that information. We want them to care, but we also want them to figure out how they can start to use that information. And if you're not a systems thinker, it gets really hard to do that.
So thank you all for your time and attention. And particularly, I just wanted to shout out, we've got some people in the audience who were among our expert interviewees. And so thank you very much for your time and expertise. And I can't click the button. Yeah, so we should take questions. We have just a couple minutes before the wrap up, but also Carmen and I are happy to hang out.
And I think before we do that, maybe we can just show them the website.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So if you're interested, we have, and you can Google Kentucky Climate Consortium. So we have the start of a group of folks who, not necessarily climate scientists, but work in some area that touches on that or have an interest in it.
I'm not a climate scientist.
All right. And our what our plan is having the groups of folks, and you can see folks who've been on here. They've indicated if they are interested in collaborating, what are some of those areas they're interested in collaborating in, whether it be coming into a classroom to speak, whether it be doing research, whether it be publications in those areas that they are interested in. So maybe I'm interested in agriculture, or maybe I'm interested in more geologic sciences or something like that. And what we're trying to do is get folks together so that we can then have these conversations about what could it look like in Kentucky. So we've been in contact with Florida and their Climate Institute to really talk with them about, and they're a very established group, about some of the things that we're doing. But part of our goal is really to start having this conversation and say, what are different people's interests and what can we start to do to, I think, advance our understanding, our knowledge, but also our preparedness as things change.
I know we have a couple questions on Zoom already, and folks in the room, if you need to get up and go, of course. So,
Okay, so anybody, we'll start with the audience. Anybody in here want to ask anything? Yes.
What was the timeline for the survey distribution?
Okay, so and I'm gonna repeat these just in case because they don't have a mic for you. So the question was, what was the timeline for the survey distribution?
so we started in March, and then closed it on July 1st. And the timeline is in part driven. So if you have not done human subjects research, you may not be familiar with the process here at the university, but there is an extended process involving getting putting an application in and getting approval from the Institutional Review Board. And we had a few hiccups with that. So we got started a little later than we had hoped to, but again, still ended up with a really high number of responses, which was great. So it was about 3.5, I can do math, 4.5 months.
And I would say a big push of that was through, just people reaching out and emailing and social media and things like that and asking people to publish it. And I know it wound up in several different newsletters and things like that.
Yeah.
A quick question, just in terms of how you were coding. Personal use for recreation, there was access and reliability. What's the difference? Or what's reliability mean in terms of recreation?
That's a good question. So we did not, repeat the question. So the question is in terms of, for say, personal use and recreational use, something like access and reliability, what's the difference between those values? We did not define the values for our survey takers. We thought about it and we decided not to for a variety of reasons. And personally, the way that we were within our research group, the way we're envisioning the difference, it was based on our interviews with experts where there can be an access issue where it's like, I literally cannot, there's a water source there, but I can't get to it because of, private land in the way, or because of, stream bank erosion has made it difficult to drive my livestock, whatever it is. Versus reliability is consistency. So when I return to that resource day after day, is it still there? Is it still available to me? So the access, the reliability piece, I think, I was assuming, and I don't know if the data supports this, I didn't look at it, that it would, more concern about reliability would connect more to concerns about infrastructure, but it might also connect to concerns about drought and flooding. So, but we would need to connect those quantitative to the qualitative problem, or what's the problem response to figure that out. It's a great question. Anyone else in the audience?
In the breakdown of respondents, did you look at whether the respondents use their expertise in the private sector versus the public sector, the non-government?
So the question is, did we look at, with demographic data, did we break down whether folks use their expertise in the private sector versus the public sector, like non-governmental? We did not distinguish between those in any way going beyond the Department of Labor categories that we were using for industry expertise, which I believe has an option for nonprofit.
Yeah, there's a scientific one in there as well.
Yeah, but so that belongs to the correlating industry experience across all of the other kind of attitudes, values, knowledge measures is in the analysis yet to come, because we started with location-based, so region-based. And the Applied Statistics Lab, as of, well, assuming that they got my email and started working on it on Monday, that's the next task, is they're going to send us another 300-page report with the breakdown of everything by industry. So yeah, so hopefully we'll have a sense of that upcoming. Melissa, did you?
All right, so great question. So the question is, with the consortium, what we publish or the products that get developed, are those going to be available and of use to folks like Melissa, who's a basing coordinator? The answer is yes, to an extent. And I will say this, anything that we do through extension, the cooperative extension service, is available for use for education. You can't go use it for your personal company type of thing, but it's free and available for that. So any kind of numbered extension publications that would come off of this, any kind of workshops, things like this, those will be out there and available. So we're recording this session for folks who couldn't make it and if they want to see it. Referee journal publications, that's a little different because it depends on the copyright issues. So, we can't just put some journals up on the web and say, here it is, but we can put citations. And it really kind of depends on that. So that's why I say it depends. Our goal is, and when a cooperative extension is to translate technical information. So, anything that we publish through like a journal article, the goal then is to translate that into a more meaningful use, hopefully, and one that could be put up on the more World Wide Web type of thing. Yeah. We want people to be able to use this. I mean, for me, it was insightful just to say how I'm doing my programming, and even when I go in and do workshops, how I could switch things around, hopefully, to better connect with my audiences.
Should we take a couple of?
Yes. Okay. We got a couple of questions. So I'll go ahead and start with Steve Evans online. You're getting identified here. So he wanted to know, were the definitions of terms randomized? And I think he was talking more about when people were defining water resources or what they felt about them. Or did people get tired and become creative at the end?
Thank you, Steve, for the question. As we were preparing for this presentation workshop session, I thought to myself, I bet someone's going to ask about that, because I had the same question when we got the data set. We did not randomize them. So the majority of our responses, as we mentioned at the beginning, were online, so we could have. The reason that we didn't is that we did have high hopes initially of also getting hard copy surveys, and we didn't want to have the data not, like if that was the case, we wanted it consistent across the data set. I say that as though it occurred to me that that would be an issue like before the fact, but it was just, we wanted the experience of the online survey to be identical to the experience of the hard copy survey. That's also why, for example, we didn't funnel people away from answering the industry question, qualitative question, even if they'd indicated that they didn't have industry experience. When I thought about this yesterday, I thought, oh gosh, it's the first day of the semester and I don't have time to do this. But what I do want to do is actually, I can check for that, right? So I can run down the data set and see if our codes are changing significantly across start to finish, because we listed them alphabetically, right? And it would be easy enough to go in and look and see if folks are, if there's a higher, we could code for level of creativity, I guess, right? Or we could code for the shift in technical definition. But as you saw from our technical definition, for example, that wasn't sorted alphabetically by any means, right? It was all over the place. And so at least in terms of people just defaulting to neutral definitions, that was not happening in an order that matched the order of the questions. The other point I wanted to make about that is, I did want to share anecdotally, a few people did have some fun with these. So I think my personal favorite was the respondent who, for every single one in which it was in any way even remotely applicable, wrote, "Let's go fishing." Which I was like, I really want to code that as affective as well. I did not, because again, it's a little hard to definitively say that it was like a positive emotional response that person was having, but it certainly felt that way. And I was like, oh, thank you. Survey responded, 248 or whatever. Okay. Another question we had was, what type of concerns did people express about rain in the technical definitions, like too much, too little? I will start this by saying, when we met with our experts to define it, and working in cooperative extension, I say it probably depends somewhat on what the rain is like that year. If you get too much, then they're concerned about too much. If you get too little, they're concerned about too little. When we did it with the experts, there was a lot of concern about too much with really the flooding. Mm-hmm. And I would say in some of the survey responses, that's probably fairly true as well, is getting more rain. And that's one of the things that we expect, obviously, in Kentucky is especially, at least in our areas here, seeing more rain as time goes on.
And so that is something I think, especially as our population's urbanizing, that's one of the things that we've been hypothesizing about too, as we get more people in urban areas, as we get more rainfall, will that too much be part of the flooding? Now, the other thing, the other flip side of that is the more getting into some of those system thinkings besides just too much rain is timing of rainfall. And that's I think the other thing we really have to think about is it's not just a too much, too little, but really when do we get the amount we get?
And we did have some respondents in that, in the expression of concern category around rain. So some of the expression concerns were actually acid rain. So a number of folks, their first kind of, we didn't ask like, what's your first problem association or negative association, but just the first thing they said in response to the word rain was acid. So we had, I think 5 of those maybe out of 350, give or take. So there are a few things in there that are not kind of specific to Kentucky-based concerns. We also, in addition to some folks saying too much, we did have folks already there in terms of saying it's either too much or too little, it's never the right amount at the right time, right? So there was some move towards that kind of broader thinking, not just a kind of isolated event of like, there's too much rain and it makes me upset, right? But just day to day, is there the right amount of rain for the needs that we have? So we did see that a little bit.
Another question was about the age of the survey participants. Did we break that down? We do have the year of birth, so we can look at that, but the stage for what we've done, we haven't broken it down to look at and say, well, did, for example, millennials respond this one way, baby boomers respond a different way, or anything like that. So we haven't broken it down by do your values change with your age experience?
Yeah, that's 2 down the line after. So the next independent variable that, as I mentioned, that we're trying to build out some correlations on is industry experience. And then the next one after that is yes, no, or other to belief in climate change, anthropogenic climate change. So we want to actually connect that back to all of these other attitudes and response types. And then after that, probably age is the next metric that we'll look at.
Okay, so another one was, are you looking for more survey respondents?
No, right now. So the survey is closed. Thank you for that question, Ronan. That said, so he says, I teach biology in community college. This is something that students can work through as part of their course. Certainly, we would be happy to share aggregate data. If people are interested in using that for educational purposes, like in a course or something, we can share. We can't share the raw data because of the IRB, the review board restrictions, but we can share the aggregate data. And certainly I would be happy to run some specific analyses if there were particular things that people are interested in. So if you're sitting there thinking, I really want to know for my region X, like we've got all the spreadsheets, like we can click the button. I personally would love to run the survey again. As I mentioned before, I would love to do it at a large scale so that we had a statistically representative sample and could make more concrete claims about regional differences and about demographically based differences. My sort of pipe dream is that we could do this in different states, right? So this could become an instrument, the WAVE survey, Water Attitudes, Values, and Education, that got implemented across different states. If that were the case, then we would treat this as a pilot and then revisit some of those questions, such as, should we do it exclusively online and randomized? Doing it exclusively online, though, as I mentioned before, it's very hard to get a statistically representative sample then, because you've got a lot of folks for whom that's not a format in which they really want to engage with this kind of activity. It's really mail outs or nothing if you want to get as broad a swath as possible, especially in kind of lower socioeconomic rural areas.
Any other questions?
Feedback
Mm-hmm.
on their survey results. So I'm just thinking about future where you might respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is, do we have any plans for sharing the data with the communities who responded? So making it public and available in some way beyond kind of publications or even open publications, but that are geared towards ag extension folks and whatnot. I'm paraphrasing your question. Okay. We have not talked about that specifically, but I would love to do that. I'm a little embarrassed to say that we haven't talked about it because I hadn't thought about it, despite the fact that in many of my other research projects, particularly where I do, am asking, non-academics for assistance, which is really what it is. When people participate in research, they're providing free help to academics. And so I do try very hard in those other projects to give back. This is the first large-scale survey that I've run. I'm actually running 2 this year, so this one, and then I'm also collaborating with the state Arboretum here in town to do a year-long visitor survey. So these are the first 2 survey projects I've done, and I will admit that I've fallen into the trap of thinking of a survey as more distant, right? I hadn't thought about them as much active research participants as in the past when I've done kind of interviews or focus groups or community-based ethnographies where there's a much more direct relationship and it is much more apparent, that need. So I'm really glad that you asked the question, and I think that's something Carmen and I should talk about, the best ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, aside of the ones that my immediate thought were when we started building this was really trying to target more like our agents who are going to be on a lot of the front lines, and that was a big part of what we were thinking of it. But there's obviously other groups. I mean, Melissa is obviously represented here for our basic coordinators, but then we also have non-formal educators who are out there, that aren't necessarily associated with cooperative extension, but then are preparing a lot of material, interacting with the public. And that was really our audience, was people who communicate with the public or preparing materials for them. How could they particularly do it? And it doesn't have to be just people who are doing education workshops. It may even be people who, like for example, LFUCG, they may have, they have environmental coordinators and things like that maybe aren't necessarily doing workshops, but they're trying to figure out how to best communicate with the public on some of the things that they need.
And I could envision too, even like, a community group is concerned about their local water and they want they're trying to do as much data gathering they can on ways to reach out to neighbors, to build coalitions. So I'm thinking, for example, I mentioned Martin County earlier, the Appalachian Law Center has been doing a ton of work out there with them, and part of the work is trying to get more people involved. So data like this might be really useful for folks who are trying to do that kind of community-based work as well.
Well,
I think that's it.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you all coming.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll make sure this gets out to folks.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all so much. This is exciting. Yeah. Video. Yay. Stop there. Yeah. We started on this last August, and this is so exciting to have all these pretty graphs. What's that, please?